My granddaughter asked me last September how I came to spend my whole life doing a man's work with a hammer and a saw. She is 17, curious the way young women are curious when they have just discovered that the world was arranged without their consent, and she wanted an answer that would be useful to her, something she could carry. I told her I would write it down. So here it is, in the autumn of 1921, from a writing table in a house I built myself, on a street that did not exist when I was her age. My hands are stiff in the mornings now. The knuckles have the look of old wood that has been through too many winters, which is accurate enough as a description. I have been a carpenter for 47 years. Before that, I was a widow with 4 children and a half-built house on the western edge of Harmon County, Minnesota, and I was watching another widow very carefully to see how she survived, the way a person in deep water watches someone swimming just ahead of them to learn the stroke. Her name was Sigrid Halverson. She was 34 years old in the summer of 1872. She had 160 acres on the Elm River tributary, 2 children, a cow named Ragna, $43 in debt, and a problem with firewood that everyone in the county assumed would be the end of her. It was not the end of her. What she did that summer, what she built in the earth behind her cabin while the county watched her yard and waited for a woodpile that never appeared, is the reason I became a carpenter. It is the reason 40 families in Harmon County stopped dreading February. And it is a story that has been told wrong or not told at all for nearly 50 years. I intend to tell it correctly. That means beginning with a woman who lived at the edge of our settlement and whom most of us, to our lasting discredit, never bothered to know. You have to understand the country first. The Red River Valley in Minnesota in the early 1870s was not a pretty landscape, and the people who came to settle it were not people who had chosen it for its beauty. They had chosen it because the land was cheap and the soil was black, and the federal government had decided to encourage the filling in of the interior by offering 160 acres of it for the price of 5 years' labor and a filing fee. The land was flat, in a way that seemed to operate beyond what the eye could reasonably hold. Flat past the horizon, flat past reason, flat in the particular way of country that was once the floor of a very large and very cold lake and has never quite recovered from the experience. The soil was good. That was the truth of the place, and the whole reason for the difficulty. The soil was black and dense and rich with the accumulated decay of centuries of grassland, and it would grow wheat if the rains came right, and corn if you caught a favorable year, and a wide variety of disappointments if you caught an unfavorable one. People came from Norway and Sweden and Germany, and from the exhausted farmland of New England, and from places in Europe whose names shifted with the century's politics, and they built their cabins and broke their ground and discovered the thing that the federal government's pamphlets had not mentioned, which was the winter. The winter came from Canada. That is the correct way to say it. It came in the way that a creditor comes, with intention and with the expectation of being received. It moved into the valley in late October, and it did not leave until April. And in the months between, it was not merely cold, but cold with conviction, cold that had made up its mind, cold that pressed down on the flat land like a hand on clay and held it there. The minimum requirement for surviving a Minnesota winter in a small log cabin was 20 cords of firewood. 20 cords is a quantity difficult to visualize if you have not spent time stacking it, so I will describe it. It is a wall of split wood 8 feet high and 40 feet long, seasoned and dry, close to your cabin door, enough to feed a fire around the clock for 6 months without running short. In a good year, with 2 able-bodied adults and a full summer of cutting, a homestead family could manage 20 to 25 cords by October. In a difficult year, with a bad spring or a wet summer or a shortage of labor, they might have 12 or 15, and they would spend January doing careful arithmetic about what remained. Every farm in Harmon County stacked its wood on the south side of the cabin, where the winter sun would keep the pile from becoming buried under drifts. By August, you could read the health of a homestead by its woodpile, the way you can read the health of a person by their color. A tall, tight stack against the south wall meant a family that was going to be fine. A thin stack or a scattered pile that hadn't been properly split, or no pile at all, those told a different story. This is why everyone in Harmon County was watching the Halverson place that summer. And this is why, by September, they had all drawn the same wrong conclusion. Peter Halverson had died in April of 1872, crushed by a maple tree he was felling for the woodlot on the south 40 of his property. He was 37 years old. He had been in the valley for 2 years, had come from a small farm in Telemark, Norway, with his wife and enough English to conduct business and enough stubbornness to attempt the rest. He was a careful man and a patient one, which are the virtues that frontier farming rewards, and by the spring of 1872, the Halverson homestead was beginning to look like something that might actually work. He left a finished cabin. He left 11 acres of broken ground. He left Ragna the cow, a team of horses, 2 pigs, a smokehouse that was half finished, and 43 trees he had felled in the woodlot over the 2 previous winters, dropped where they lay, limbed and waiting to be bucked and split when he found the time. He left Sigrid and 2 children, Britta, who was 7, and Knut, who was 5, and $43 in debt to Dorothea Pemberton's lending operation on the main street of Harmon. He left, in short, the bones of something that might sustain a family, surrounded by the particular silence that follows a man who was the loudest presence in a place and is no longer there. Sigrid buried him at the edge of the woodlot where the wild plum grew in a thicket along the fence line, said the words over him in Norwegian because her English went thin under the weight of real need, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pencil and calculated what it would take to survive the winter. The numbers were not good. 20 cords minimum. She could cut perhaps 4 herself before the first snow, working alone with the bucking saw rigged to a post and rope, performing the job of 2 people at roughly half their pace. She could buy perhaps 6 more cords at the going rate of $4.50 per cord. If she sold the second pig now, before it needed feeding through winter. That left her 10 cords short of the minimum, with a winter coming that the old-timers were already calling unusual. She was considering her options. Selling the land was one of them, though not to Dorothea Pemberton, never to Dorothea Pemberton, when a knock came at the door in the first week of July. She opened it to find an old woman she knew only slightly, standing on the step with a basket of dried fish and a question that changed the entire shape of Sigrid's situation. The woman's name was Ayasha. Before I tell you about Ayasha, I need to tell you about Dorothea Pemberton, because Dorothea is the reason this story has stakes beyond one woman's survival. Dorothea had come to Harmon County in 1861 with her husband Gerald, who had built a dry goods store and a small lending practice before dying of pneumonia in 1865 and leaving both enterprises to his widow. Dorothea ran them better than Gerald had, which was not difficult, as Gerald had possessed charm and optimism in quantities that frequently substituted for competence. Dorothea possessed neither charm nor optimism, and substituted nothing for competence. She simply had it. By 1872, she was the most financially powerful person in the county, achieved not by any particular dishonesty. Her books were impeccable, her contracts were clear, her rates were high but not unlawful, but by patience. She had a talent for watching and waiting. She knew who was struggling and who had margin. She extended credit when it was needed and collected it firmly when it was due. When a homestead went under, which happened with regularity in those years, she was always positioned to make an offer at the moment when the sellers could not afford to refuse. She had driven out to the Halverson place in May, after Peter died, to express her condolences and to remind Sigrid quietly of the $43. She had looked at the property with the eye she carried everywhere, the appraiser's eye, always measuring, always calculating, and she had seen good land, good cabin, good water access from the tributary, worth considerably more than $43 if the widow could not hold it. Through the summer of 1872, She made it her business to pass the Halverson property whenever the road gave her occasion, which she arranged more frequently than the road strictly required. She was looking for the woodpile. In July, no woodpile. In August, no woodpile. Only Sigrid moving steadily across the yard in the early morning, carrying water, tending the garden, moving with the particular economy of motion of a person who has calculated her energy as carefully as her money and wastes none of it. Britta and Knut trailing behind her, small and serious. The way children become serious when they have understood that the household's functioning depends in some part on their not creating additional problems. In September, no woodpile. Every other cabin in the county by this point had at least the beginning of a stack against the south wall. The Neff family, a quarter-mile east, had 8 cords already split and drying. The Lindqvists, 2 miles north, had 12. Even the Bauman family, who had arrived the previous spring and were still orienting themselves to the particular demands of a Minnesota autumn, had a respectable 4 cords started. Dorothea stopped at the general store on a Tuesday afternoon in late September and told the room what she had concluded. "The widow has given up," she said. "She is not cutting. She is not buying. She has no wood and no means to get it." She used the flat, declarative tone of someone announcing arithmetic rather than opinion. "I expect she will come to me before December. She cannot carry that debt through another season, not alone." The room, which contained a hardware merchant, a feed supplier, a land agent, and my own husband Thomas, still alive in September, dead by November, received this information with the various expressions people use when they privately agree with something they are not entirely comfortable agreeing with publicly. There was some murmuring. Someone said it was a hard thing, a woman alone with 2 small ones. Someone else said the land was too much for a widow without help. Thomas came home that evening and told me what had been said. I was at the stove with our own firewood situation, which was also not comfortable, though not as dire as Sigrid's was assumed to be. I said that I did not know Sigrid Halverson well enough to know what she was or was not capable of. Thomas said that was fair. But I had seen her in that yard in August, moving with that particular economy, and I had noted something that none of the people in Dorothea Pemberton's general store had thought to note, which was this: Sigrid Halverson did not look like a woman who had given up. She looked like a woman who was doing something that required all of her attention. I did not know yet what that something was. I would find out. Ayasha had lived at the northern boundary of the Halverson property since before the Halversons arrived, which is to say since before most of us arrived, which is to say for longer than any of us knew precisely. Her structure sat in a bend of the Elm River tributary where the bank curved west and the cottonwood trees grew thick enough to provide a windbreak on 3 sides. It was neither the traditional dwelling of her people nor the log cabin of the settlers, but something she had built from both kinds of understanding, low to the ground, tight against weather, oriented to catch the morning light through its single south-facing window. Her garden was the most productive in the county, though almost no one in the county knew this because almost no one had been to see it. The Ojibwe people had been in that valley for generations beyond counting. The settlers had been there for a decade, some of them for less. This arithmetic should have made Ayasha a source of considerable practical knowledge for the people who had arrived in her landscape and were attempting to learn it from scratch. It did not work that way. It rarely works that way. The settlers looked at Ayasha and saw an old woman living alone at the edge of things, and they let the looking stop there, which is a habit of mind that costs people more than they generally calculate. Sigrid had not let the looking stop there. This was one of the things I came to understand about her only in retrospect, that she possessed a quality of attention that operated without the usual filters. She looked at what was in front of her rather than at what she expected to find, which is a more difficult skill than it sounds, and rarer than it should be. In the 2 years of the Halverson homestead, she and Ayasha had developed a relationship based on the exchange of useful information in minimal words. Ayasha had shown her where the safe mushrooms grew along the tributary bank and which of the valley's plants held medicinal properties, identified in the specific, unhurried way of someone who has learned from a long chain of teachers. Sigrid had shared flour, salt pork, and the particular companionship of a neighboring woman who did not require conversation to fill every available silence. They understood each other in the efficient way that two women doing difficult work alone sometimes understand each other, without explanation, without performance, without waste. So when Ayasha appeared at the Halverson cabin door in the first week of July, with a basket of dried fish and a question, Sigrid opened the door fully and stood aside to let her in. Not everyone would have. I want to be precise about that. Sigrid had been at the bucking saw when she heard the knock, working one of Peter's felled maples with the solo rig she had improvised from a stake driven into the ground and a length of rope to hold the log's near end steady. The saw was designed for two people, one pulling while the other guides, and working it alone produced results that were correct but slow, and her arms by mid-morning had the deep fatigue of muscles asked to perform double duty. She had cut 3/4 of a cord since dawn. She needed 20. The arithmetic was something she kept to the back of her mind, the way you keep a pain you can do nothing about. Acknowledged, present, not dwelt upon. She wiped her hands on her trousers and went to the door. Ayasha stepped inside without ceremony, set the fish basket on the table, and looked around the cabin with the particular attention of someone assessing structural facts. She looked at the stove, at the window facing south, at the height of the ceiling. Then she looked at Sigrid. "Where are you going to keep your winter wood?" Sigrid said what anyone in Harmon County would have said. "Outside," she said, "against the south wall. Where else would a person keep wood?" Ayasha sat down on the bench beside the table, which she did without being invited, in the way of someone who has long since stopped performing the social formalities of people who have not extended them to her in any consistent fashion. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. She was not a woman who hesitated, but organizing, the way a careful person organizes before speaking, to say the necessary thing rather than the approximate thing. "In this country," she said, "the wood that sits outside takes in the rain and the snow and the freeze and the thaw, all of it, through the whole autumn, before you ask it to burn. By January, what you have outside is not the wood you stacked in September. It is heavier. It gives less heat. It burns faster to give that lesser heat. You use more of it and get less from it and wonder why the winter is harder than you expected." She set her hands flat on the table. "My people keep certain things in the earth, not everything. But the things that must stay dry underground. Wood stored below the frost line in July is the same wood in February. The earth does not let the season touch it. You would have less wood above the ground and more warmth in the cabin, and the wood you had would last." Sigrid stood at the end of the table and listened with the complete attention she brought to things that mattered. I know this because she described the conversation to me years later, and the quality of her memory of it, the precision of what she retained, the specific words, the particular sequence, is the memory of someone who understood in the moment that they were receiving something important. She asked one question first, before any of the practical questions. She asked, "How do you know this works?" Ayasha's answer was simple. "My grandmother's grandmother knew it. She taught it down through the women of my family for a long time. I have used it here. It works." Sigrid nodded. Then she sat down and began asking the practical questions. What Ayasha taught her in the next 2 hours was not a set of instructions. It was a principle, and from the principle the instructions could be derived by anyone willing to think carefully. This distinction mattered, as I later came to understand. Instructions without principle produce people who can follow a recipe but cannot adapt when the recipe fails. Principle produces people who can build something they have never seen, in soil they have never worked, with materials they must improvise. The principle was this: wood is not a sealed material. It breathes through its end grain. the cross-section of the cut face where the cellular structure of the tree is exposed. Every rain that falls on a woodpile enters through those exposed ends. Every morning of heavy dew, every melting snow that runs down through the stack and pools at the bottom. The wood takes the moisture in and holds it, bound in the cellular structure. And what you are burning in January is not just wood, but wood and water, which burns reluctantly, which turns its energy first to driving off the water as steam before producing useful heat, which gives back perhaps 60 cents of warmth for every dollar of fuel consumed. Underground, below the frost line, there is no rain. There is no dew, there is no freeze-thaw cycle working moisture into the stack from above. The temperature stays between 40 and 50 degrees through the entire year. The earth absorbs summer's heat slowly, stores it, releases it slowly through winter, and arrives at February having changed perhaps 5 degrees from where it began in June. In that stable, dry, still air, wood does not take in moisture. It only gives it off. Wood stored underground in July is drier in February than wood stored outside in October. The earth keeps what it holds, and what it holds, it keeps dry. Ayasha demonstrated the end grain principle with a split log she had brought in the fish basket. Sigrid told me this later, and I have always found it remarkable that she brought the log, that she came prepared to teach rather than merely to suggest. She ran her thumb along the cut face of the wood, tracing the rings. "Here," she said, "every rain comes in here." Sigrid looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "Then underground there is no rain to come in." Correct. Sigrid asked the practical questions then, one after another. In the methodical way she approached all problems of construction and provision. How deep must the chamber be? How do you keep the walls from collapsing? How do you prevent water from pooling in the floor? How large for 20 cords? What about rot? What keeps the wood from going soft in the earth? Ayasha answered each question with the unhurried specificity of someone who is not in any hurry to appear impressive and is therefore willing to take the time to be accurate. At least 6 feet deep, preferably 8, to reach below the frost line and enter the zone of stable temperature. The walls needed shoring, timber or flat stone, anything that could carry the lateral pressure of the surrounding earth and hold its shape through the seasonal ground movement of the upper layers. Water was managed with slope and drainage. The tunnel entrance must be positioned on higher ground than the chamber floor, and the floor itself must be laid with flat stones so that any water entering moved toward the tunnel and drained out rather than pooling beneath the wood. The ventilation was the most critical element and the one most often neglected. Wood underground without air circulation would develop a white mold, go soft at the core, become useless within a single season. A second shaft was needed, rising from the far end of the chamber to the surface, creating a slow, steady draw, air entering through the tunnel, crossing the stored wood, and exiting through the shaft. Not much air, enough. Sigrid listened to all of it, and at the end she was quiet for a time that Ayasha did not fill, because Ayasha understood the value of silence in which a person is thinking. Then Sigrid said, "I have 4 months before the first frost. I have tools. I have the timber from Peter's felled trees for shoring." She looked at the table. "I can dig." Ayasha stood, picked up the empty fish basket, and moved to the door. "Yes," she said, "you can." She began on the 11th of August, a Monday, in the hour before full sunrise, when the clay held the night's relative cool and had not yet baked to its afternoon hardness. She had spent 10 days between Ayasha's visit and the first spade stroke in careful preparation, because Sigrid was not a woman who began a large project before she had thought it through to its conclusions. She walked the property behind the cabin every evening after the children were in bed, reading the ground the way Ayasha had taught her to read it, feeling for slope with her feet, noting where water ran after a rain, finding the high ground, testing soil consistency with a post-hole digger at intervals across the area behind the cabin. She needed to position the tunnel entrance uphill of the chamber. She needed to avoid the low ground where spring melt would run. She needed to stay clear of the large maple root system that spread 40 feet from the tree Peter had planted in his first year on the property. She found her location 15 feet behind the cabin's rear wall, slightly elevated in a natural rise that the creek had deposited over centuries. She marked the rectangle, 20 feet long, 12 feet wide. She removed the topsoil carefully and set it aside for the kitchen garden. Then the clay began. Minnesota River Valley clay is a substance I have had reason to know well in my years of construction, and I can tell you that it is not unfriendly to work, but it is honest about what it costs. It is dense and cohesive, laid down over centuries by glacial runoff, and it holds its shape well once cut, which would matter later for the chamber walls. But it does not yield to a spade with any enthusiasm. Each stroke went in fully and came up heavy. Each bucket was a full bucket. Sigrid moved the excavated clay in a wooden wheelbarrow to a growing mound 20 feet east of the dig site, working in the early morning and the late afternoon, resting in the midday heat, resuming when the air cooled. Britta and Knut were assigned their own tasks. Britta, 7 and careful, was responsible for the morning water and for watching Knut, who at 5 had the particular gift of small children for introducing entropy into organized systems. Knut was assigned the job of sorting excavated stones from the clay as his mother dumped each load, flat stones to one pile, round stones to another, which kept him occupied and produced a supply of flat stones that Sigrid would later need for the tunnel floor. He performed this task with great seriousness and some creative interpretation of the categories. By the end of the first week, she had excavated approximately 12 inches of depth across the full rectangle. The work was proceeding. It was proceeding slowly, but the arithmetic of slow, steady work across 4 months resolved differently than it appeared in the first week, and Sigrid understood this. The crisis came in the 3rd week of August, on a Wednesday afternoon, when her spade broke through into a layer of perched water sitting between 2 clay strata, a thin lens of groundwater held up by an impermeable layer below it, not a full seep, not enough to flood, but enough to make the excavation floor soft and unreliable, the kind of soft that would not hold a floor of flat stones without settling and shifting. Sigrid stood at the edge of the hole and looked at it for a while. Then she set down the spade and walked to the north boundary of the property. She was back within the hour, with Ayesha beside her. Ayesha descended into the excavation, not without effort, but without ceremony, and crouched at the soft floor and pressed her palm into it and held it there. She stood. She looked at the walls. She looked at the slope of the surrounding ground. She was quiet for a long moment, in the way she was quiet when she was doing arithmetic of her own. 4 feet north, she said. Raise the floor 6 inches with gravel. The lens does not extend north of here. The clay changes. You will find solid ground. She climbed out of the hole and walked back toward the tributary without further discussion, because what needed to be said had been said. Sigrid stood at the edge of the failed excavation for a time. 3 weeks of work displaced. The calendar was not a generous document at that point in the summer. She picked up her spade. She moved 4 feet north. She began again. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not announce itself. It does not argue. It does not explain itself to people who have not asked for the explanation. It simply solves problems one after another in the order in which they present themselves, and the evidence of its operation is visible only in what gets built. Sigrid Halvorsen had that kind of intelligence. I came to understand this fully only in the years after that winter, when I was learning carpentry in earnest and could look back at what she had built and name, with the vocabulary I had by then acquired, the principles she had applied without vocabulary for any of them. She had no engineering training. She had no formal knowledge of soil mechanics or thermodynamics or the behavior of timber under lateral load. What she had was the principle Ayesha had given her and the habit of mind that derives specific solutions from general principles without requiring someone else to perform the derivation first. This is what I mean when I say she built something. Not merely that she moved earth and stacked wood. She reasoned a structure into existence in soil she was still learning, with materials she had to evaluate as she found them, against a calendar that had no interest in her difficulties. I want to describe the building accurately because it deserves accuracy. The details are not incidental to the story. They are the story. A woman who survived because she was lucky is a different story than a woman who survived because she thought carefully and worked precisely. Sigrid was the second kind, and that distinction matters. She began the relocated dig on the 23rd of August, on higher ground 4 feet north of the failed first attempt, in soil that behaved as Ayasha had predicted, firmer below the topsoil layer, the clay dense and consistent without the lens of perched water that had softened the original site. The spade went in and came up heavy and solid. When Sigrid reached 3 feet of depth and pressed the handle of the tool into the floor to test its resistance, it held. She had lost 3 weeks. She had 8 weeks remaining before the date she had set as her deadline, the 1st of November, which the old-timers in Harmon held as the reliable date of first heavy snow in an ordinary year, and which felt, in the dry August heat of 1872, impossibly distant and urgently close at the same time. The failed excavation to the south was not wasted. She incorporated it into the design, which is the kind of adaptation that looks like improvisation from outside and is actually engineering from within. The original hole, now abandoned as the main chamber site, became the beginning of her tunnel approach. She graded its floor, extended it downward at a consistent slope toward the new chamber site, and created the entrance ramp that Ayasha had specified. A descent wide enough to drag a loaded sledge through, positioned on higher ground than the chamber floor, so that any water entering at the surface would flow by gravity toward the tunnel mouth and out, rather than deeper in. She lined the tunnel floor with the flat stones Canute had been sorting. He received a formal acknowledgment of this contribution, which he accepted with the dignity of a 5-year-old being taken seriously, laying them in 2 layers, larger stones on the bottom and smaller flat pieces on top, fitted close enough to provide a firm surface for the sledge runners while maintaining the slight slope that would carry water out. The work was slow and particular, requiring her to select each stone by feel as much as by sight, choosing flat over round, stable over loose. By the end of the first week of September, the tunnel was complete to a depth of 4 feet and a length of 11 feet, and the graded ramp descended smoothly from the yard level to the point where the main chamber would begin. The main chamber itself, 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, 8 feet deep by the time she was done. She worked the floor first, leveling it with the same gravel and flat stone technique Ayasha had specified, building up the 6 inches of drainage substrate from the river tributary in buckets that Britta now carried alongside the water. Britta was 7 and strong for her age and had the focused reliability that some children develop when they understand that reliability is needed, a quality that I have seen in children of capable widows more often than in children of easier circumstances, as though difficulty sharpens certain things that ease allows to remain soft. The walls came next, and here Sigrid faced the problem she had been thinking about since Ayasha's visit. How to shore an 8-foot-deep earthen chamber against the pressure of the surrounding soil using materials available on the property in the time remaining. Peter's felled trees gave her the answer. He had felled 43 trees in the woodlot over 2 winters, maple and oak and 1 stand of ash along the eastern fence line, and had left them where they dropped, limbed and waiting, planning to buck and split them when the summer schedule gave him room. The summer schedule had not given him room, and then April had given him nothing at all, and the trees had been lying in the woodlot for 1 to 2 years, drying slowly in the open air, the bark beginning to check and split in the way of wood that is losing its moisture steadily and without interruption. Seasoned timber, already drying, already on the property. Sigrid selected the straightest sections first, trunk lengths that were consistent in diameter, free of large knots, dense enough to carry load without checking further under pressure. She bucked them to length with the same solo rig saw she had been using for cordwood, cutting uprights for the chamber walls in 8-foot lengths and horizontal rails in 12-foot and 20-foot lengths to span the chamber's width and depth. The timber was heavy, heavier than green wood would have been in some respects because the drying had concentrated its cellular structure, and moving it from the woodlot to the excavation site required the wheelbarrow and multiple trips and the application of a rope and pulley system she rigged from a branch of the yard's single standing oak. The shoring design she arrived at was one I later recognized, when I had learned enough to recognize it, as a simplified version of the timber framing used in mine shafts. Vertical uprights at regular intervals along each wall, horizontal rails spanning between them at top and bottom, the whole assembly transferring the lateral pressure of the surrounding clay to vertical compression along the uprights, which the timber could carry without difficulty. She had not seen a mine shaft. She had not been told about mine shafts. She had looked at the problem, earth pressing inward on 4 walls simultaneously, and derived the solution from the geometry of the forces involved. 8 feet of clay pressing laterally is a specific load. A vertical timber of sufficient diameter carries that load in compression. Connect the verticals with horizontals and you have a frame that holds its shape. She told me once, years later, that she had thought about it by imagining what would happen to the chamber if she removed one wall entirely, visualizing the earth's movement, the direction of the forces, what would need to resist them. This is not a carpenter's training speaking. This is a person who thinks in structures. The shoring took most of September. She set uprights first, dropped into holes she drove at the base of each wall, then fitted the horizontal rails between them with the tight tolerance that clay soil demands. Any gap between the timber frame and the earth behind it would allow the clay to creep inward under the pressure of the seasonal ground movement in the upper layers. Where the timber did not fit flush against the excavated wall, she packed the gap with smaller pieces, scraps from the bucking, until the frame was solid against the earth on all 4 sides. My own contribution to this phase was, as I mentioned, the timber I traded for use of Sigrid's wagon and team. Lengths I had saved from the abandoned addition to my own cabin, wood I had no immediate use for, and that was doing nothing more useful than weathering in my yard. I drove it over in mid-September, 2 loads, and Sigrid and I spent an afternoon fitting the pieces where she needed them. I did not fully understand what I was helping to build at that point. I understood that it was a storage structure of some kind, underground, and that Sigrid had thought about it very carefully, and that the timber needed to be placed at specific intervals for reasons she explained to me with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining things to people who do not yet have the context to understand them quickly. I remembered everything she told me. I used it for the next 40 years. In the last week of September, with the shoring complete and the chamber floor laid, Sigrid turned to the element Ayasha had warned her about, most specifically, the ventilation shaft. The principle was clear enough. Air needed to move through the chamber, in through the tunnel entrance at one end, across the stacked wood, and out through a secondary shaft at the far end, creating a slow circulation that would carry moisture away from the wood without creating a draft strong enough to disturb the temperature stability that made the whole system work. The shaft needed to rise from the far corner of the chamber to the surface, a vertical distance of 8 feet, plus the depth of the topsoil, and it needed to be capped at the surface with something that kept rain out while keeping air moving. She dug the shaft first, cutting a narrow column of clay from the chamber's far corner upward through the ceiling, and continuing through 8 feet of solid earth to the surface. The clay came down on her repeatedly in the early stages of this work. Digging upward through unstable material is a different proposition from digging downward through it, and she lost 2 full days to a collapse that filled the shaft to half its depth and required her to begin again with a different approach. She cut the shaft oversize and lined it with split cedar as she went, building the lining upward from the chamber floor in sections, each section holding the walls open for the section above it. The cap she designed herself. It was a peaked wooden cover, 4-sided, fitted over the surface opening of the shaft on a slight rise of packed clay that she built up around the shaft mouth to direct surface water away from the opening. 3 sides of the cap were solid. The 4th side, facing away from the prevailing wind, leeward, as a sailor would say, though Sigrid used no such word, was open from the peak down to a point 18 inches above the shaft mouth, creating an aperture through which air could move. She tested it on a calm morning by burning a small bundle of damp grass inside the chamber, watching where the smoke went. It rose, moved laterally across the chamber ceiling, and disappeared up the shaft. The draw was slow but consistent. She went back upstairs and held her hand over the cap opening and felt the faint upward movement of air. Then, 3 days later, a line of storms came through the valley from the northwest, the first serious weather of the autumn, the kind that arrives in late September in Minnesota as a reminder of what is coming. And she tested the ventilation again the morning after, with the wind still running at 20 miles from the northwest. The smoke came back down. She stood in the chamber with the acrid smell of reversed draft around her and looked at the shaft opening and understood what had happened. The wind, striking the open face of the cap directly, was pushing air down the shaft rather than allowing the natural thermal draw to pull it up. The leeward opening was facing the wrong direction. She had built the cap with the opening facing southwest, assuming the prevailing winds came from the northwest, which they did, but the storm system had brought wind from a different quarter, and more importantly, she had positioned the opening on the windward face rather than the leeward one, which reversed the pressure differential entirely. She climbed out of the chamber, removed the cap, rotated it 180 degrees on its base, and refitted it with the open face pointing northeast, away from every wind direction that a Minnesota autumn was likely to send. She burned the damp grass again. The smoke rose, crossed the ceiling, disappeared up the shaft, and did not come back. She stood for a moment in the chamber in the particular stillness of someone who has just fixed a thing that needed fixing and feels the specific satisfaction of a solution that holds. Then she went upstairs and began loading the sledge. The 1st of October arrived with a sky that had changed color overnight, from the high, clear blue of a Minnesota summer to the lower, denser blue of a sky that has begun thinking about winter, a blue with gray in it, a blue that knows something. Sigrid knew what it knew. She had the chamber and the tunnel and the drainage floor and the shoring and the ventilation and the sealed cap. And she had until the 1st of November, which was 31 days, and she had approximately 6 cords of Peter's wood already cut from her summer work with the solo rig saw, and she had the remaining 37 of his felled trees in the woodlot waiting to be bucked and split. And she had the labor trade she had arranged with the Neff family and the cash purchase she had negotiated with Hedda Sorensen, who was leaving the county before the cold and needed money more urgently than firewood. The numbers, for the first time since she had sat at the kitchen table in April with a pencil and a sheet of paper, were beginning to resolve. Not comfortably, not with margin to spare, but in the direction of sufficiency, which was all she had asked of them. She loaded the first cord onto the sledge on the 2nd of October. Wood she had cut herself, dragged from the woodlot to the yard, loaded onto the low, wide platform she had built from salvaged planks, narrow enough to pass through the tunnel entrance, and pulled it down the ramp into the chamber by the rope she had rigged to a post at the tunnel's lower end. At the bottom of the ramp she stopped, and in the lamplight she looked at the first stacked row of wood in the new chamber, and she rested her hand on the cut face of the topmost log, the end grain, where the wood breathes. And it was dry. Outside the wind had shifted. It was coming from the north. The old-timers had been right. The winter of 1872 to 1873 became, in the memory of everyone who lived through it in Harmon County, simply the hard winter, spoken in the specific tonal register that people reserve for events they would not have believed possible before they happened, and do not expect to repeat, though they know the country well enough not to promise anything. It was not the worst winter in the valley's recorded history. It was, however, the worst that any living person in Harmon County had experienced, and experience is the only history that instructs the body, which is the part of a person that has to get up in the morning and feed the stove. The cold came in earnest in the last week of December. Not the exploratory cold of November, which announces itself and retreats, testing. This was the decided cold, the cold that had made up its mind, that moved into the valley from Canada with the settled intention of a long visit. The temperature dropped to 22 below zero on New Year's Day of 1873 and did not return above zero until the 15th of January. The snow fell in the first week, and then the wind took it and redistributed it according to its own logic, which bore no relationship to where people needed to walk or drive. And by mid-January, the drifts had buried the bottom third of most cabin walls and filled in roads that men had cleared the previous week as thoroughly as if the clearing had never occurred. I was burning wood at a rate that frightened me. I had stacked 16 cords in October, which I had believed, on the basis of the previous 2 winters, to be a reasonable provision for 4 children and a cabin of my dimensions. I had not known, because no one had told me, and I had not yet had reason to know, that my 16 cords were not 16 cords in any useful sense of the term. They were 16 cords of wood that had sat outside through October and November, through 6 weeks of rain and snow and the particular freeze-thaw cycling of a Minnesota autumn, and had absorbed that weather into their end grain the way Ayesha's log had demonstrated, the way I now understood wood to do, the way every cord of outdoor stored firewood in Harmon County was doing simultaneously. Wet wood burns. I want to be precise about this because the common assumption is that wet wood does not burn, and that assumption is wrong in a way that kills people. Wet wood burns. It simply burns at a fraction of its potential, spending the first portion of its energy driving off the water it has absorbed before it can produce useful heat, consuming itself at a faster rate to deliver a smaller return. I was burning what should have been 3 days' wood in 2 days. By the 20th of January, I had 9 cords remaining. The arithmetic at the end of that calculation was not 9 cords against 3 months of winter. It was 9 cords of wet wood, giving back perhaps 60% of their rated heat, against 3 months of the worst winter in living memory. I was not alone in this calculation. Arvid Neff went to the wood merchant in Harmon in the 3rd week of January and was told the merchant's stock was gone, sold before Christmas, which had seemed at the time like good business, and now seemed like a catastrophe distributed across the county in individual portions. The Lindqvist family, 2 miles north, had begun cutting green timber from standing trees in January, which is the thing you do when you have run through your stored wood and have no other option, and green timber cut in January burns the way wet wood burns, but worse. More steam, more smoke, less heat, requiring such constant tending that someone in the Lindqvist cabin was awake at the stove at all hours, feeding a fire that gave back barely enough warmth to justify the sleeplessness. Through all of this, the Halverson cabin chimney produced its smoke in the particular way I had been noticing since November. Steady, unhurried, the thin gray column of a fire that was burning well on dry wood without the interrupted, struggling quality of chimneys working against wet fuel. I had noticed it in November and filed the observation without yet having the explanation for it. By January, I had begun to understand, in the way that a person who is running short of something understands the value of what someone nearby appears to have in abundance. On the 3rd of February, the temperature was 11 below zero at sunrise. I hitched my horse, told my eldest, who was 14 and capable, to watch the fire and the younger children, and drove to the Halverson property. Sigrid answered the door in a wool dress and her indoor boots, which told me before she said a word that her cabin was genuinely warm, not the borderline warmth of a fire-fighting wet wood to a draw, but the deep-settled warmth of a room where the fuel is behaving itself. The stove was burning with the steady, almost quiet efficiency of dry hardwood at proper combustion temperature. There was bread in the oven. Britta and Canute were at the table with a reading primer. She looked at me and knew why I had come, which is one of the things I appreciated most about Sigrid. She did not require elaborate approach. "Come and see," she said. She put on her coat and boots and led me around the back of the cabin to a rise in the ground I had walked past without examining on the 2 previous occasions I had visited the property. There was a low mound, and at the base of the mound, a wooden door, heavy oak planking, double thickness, fitted tight into a frame that was packed around its edges with straw. She pulled it open and held up her lantern and gestured for me to go first. I went in. The tunnel sloped downward at a grade that was easy to walk, the floor laid with flat stones that my boots found firm and dry. The temperature rose as I descended, not dramatically, not into any kind of warmth, but away from the 11 below of the surface air into something that felt, by contrast, almost temperate. The air was still. In the deep winter valley where every exterior breath of air was moving, the stillness underground was itself remarkable, a physical sensation distinct from temperature, the absence of wind as something you could feel on your face. At the bottom of the tunnel I stepped into the chamber, and I stopped. The wood was stacked in rows that ran the full length of the space. 20 feet of stacked cordwood, row upon row, reaching from the gravel floor to within 2 feet of the timbered ceiling. In the lamplight, the cut faces of the split logs showed the pale gold color of dry hardwood, not the dark, moisture-darkened gray of outdoor stored wood in February. I reached out and broke a small piece from the end of the nearest birch log. It snapped. The sound was the clean, sharp report of dry wood, the sound that green wood and wet wood cannot make, a sound I had not heard from my own woodpile since October. I brought it to my nose, wood smell, clean and mineral, without the sour note of moisture or the white fur smell of beginning mold. I stood there for a moment in the still underground air with that piece of birch in my hand, and I did the arithmetic I should have done the previous August when I had watched Sigrid moving in her yard with that quality of focused, deliberate attention, and had correctly identified it as something other than surrender. 22 cords remaining, she told me when I asked. Perhaps 23. She had not needed to draw it down quickly. She had not needed to draw it down at all beyond the ordinary pace of a well-managed fire on well-dried wood. I asked her how much she could spare. She had already thought about this. 6 cords for the Lindqvists, she said. They had children, and their situation was the most precarious. She could manage the transfers that week if I could send word to them and arrange the sledge work with their eldest boy. She looked at me. "And you," she said. "How short are you?" I told her. She was quiet for a moment, not with hesitation, but with the arithmetic of a person who knows exactly what she has and is calculating what she can give. 3 cords, she said. "You can manage on 3 cords of dry wood from here if you bank the stove properly at night." She was right. I managed. The Lindqvist family received their 6 cords on the 7th of February, loaded onto their wagon by Hedvig and her eldest son and Sigrid and me in a temperature that frosted our breath into white clouds that hung for a moment and then were taken by the wind. Hedvig held the last piece of wood for a moment before setting it on the stack, turning it in her hands, feeling the dryness of it against her palms. She did not say anything. She climbed up to the wagon seat. Word moved through the county the way useful information moves through a small community under pressure, quickly, directly, without embellishment, because embellishment wastes time and people had stoves to tend. By the 2nd week of February, most of Harmon County knew that the Halverson widow had 30 cords of dry firewood stored in an underground chamber she had dug herself the previous summer, that the wood was as dry as it had been in October, and that the chamber had cost her nothing but labor and the summer months that everyone else had assumed she was wasting. Dorothea Pemberton drove out herself on a Friday in the 3rd week of February, which surprised those who knew her habits, as she did not generally make personal calls in conditions that required heavy wool and ice-shod horses. She arrived mid-morning and asked to see the chamber, and Sigrid showed her the tunnel, the shoring, the drainage floor, the ventilation shaft, the stacked wood, the whole of it, and explained the principle in her careful English, the same explanation she had given to me and to the Lindqvists, and to the 4 other families who had come, by that point, to see. Dorothea walked the length of the chamber without speaking, in the way she had of assessing things before she would speak about them. At the far wall she turned. "Who taught you this?" "Ayasha," Sigrid said. "The woman on the north boundary." A pause. "The old Ojibwe woman." "Yes." Dorothea was quiet for a moment of a different quality than her ordinary silences. Then, "I have been lending money in this county for 12 years. I drove past this property a great many times last summer and concluded that I understood what I was seeing." She looked at the rows of dry wood and then at Sigrid. "I was wrong about what I was seeing." Sigrid received this with a nod that was neither forgiving nor unforgiving, simply accurate. Outside in the cold yard, Dorothea paused before climbing back into her sleigh. She did not make an offer on the land. She had understood, I believe, that she was not in a position to make offers that morning. She asked only one question, and she asked it quietly, in the manner of someone who has been thinking about a thing for some time and has finally decided to say it aloud. "What would it have taken for me to have known about this in July?" Sigrid looked at her with the pale gray eyes that I had come to understand, gave away less than they seemed to, and gave away more than people thought. "You would have had to ask Ayasha," she said. Dorothea drove back to town. She built her own underground chamber that summer, hired rather than dug herself, but correctly designed and properly ventilated. It served her for the remaining years she kept the property. Ayasha died in the spring of 1875 in her house by the tributary, in the quiet way of very old people who have decided they are finished. Sigrid was with her. She told me what Ayasha said near the end, told me precisely in the same words each time, because it was the kind of thing you do not paraphrase. "This knowledge is older than I am. It is older than my grandmother. It only matters that it keeps moving. Give it to the next person who needs it. That is all it asks." By the summer of 1873, Clara Neff had broken ground on her own chamber, consulting Sigrid at every stage. The Lindqvists began theirs in June. I built mine in July, and it was in the building of it that I understood I was a carpenter, that I had looked at a problem in the earth and solved it with timber and stone and the logic of forces, and that the solving had felt like the thing I was supposed to be doing. I have been doing it since. By 1880, more than 40 families in Harmon County stored their firewood underground. The February of 1873, the wetwood desperate February, the month of failing piles and green timber and stoves that could not be asked to do what stoves needed to do, became a story people told to explain why they had changed, not a condition they repeated. The original chamber beneath the Halverson property was filled in sometime in the 1920s, after the family moved to coal heat and the timbers finally completed their slow return to the earth that had held them. What had been a room full of dry wood for 40 winters became soil again. The earth is patient about reclaiming what it lends. But here is what I want my granddaughter to understand, and what I have been working toward since the first page of this account. Sigrid Halverson did not survive that winter because she was exceptional in any way the county would have recognized. She was a widow alone with 2 children and a debt and 80 acres of hard clay. She survived because she listened to a woman that no one else was listening to, and because she was willing to spend a summer doing invisible work that looked from the road, from Dorothea Pemberton's appraiser's eyes, from the general store's accumulated wisdom, exactly like nothing. She dug a hole and filled it and sealed it and said nothing about it, and in February she opened it and there was everything she needed, dry and waiting, undamaged by the winter that had damaged everything else. The spade went into the earth in August. The door opened in February. Between those 2 acts was a summer of labor that no one witnessed, and a winter of vindication that no one expected, and the distance between them was not luck or strength or any special gift. It was the willingness to do the necessary work before anyone could see why it was necessary. I have tried to do the same in my way for 47 years. The hammer goes in, the nail holds, the wall stands. That is the whole of it, and it is enough.